Welcome, professional wrestling fans, to today's edition of PWR Express. We're going to talk about TNA Impact, the Christmas edition, just last night on Spike TV. And thanks so much for tuning in here at the site. And big news coming out of Impact, obviously, for those of you that didn't read the spoilers. Mick Foley announcing his return to the ring, coming up at Genesis on January the 11th on pay-per-view. And also an advancing of Chris Sabin in that X Division tournament. A couple of news bits and a couple of items to point out coming from this episode of Impact. What a match between Chris Sabin and Kyoshi. Just an excellent way to kick off the show. Unfortunately, that would be the only match, the only actual wrestling match in the first entire hour of TNA Impact. They would rebound in the second hour with 3 matches, but really surprising to only have one match in a 1-hour time frame on a weekly wrestling show. But they filled the rest of the hour pretty solidly, I think, especially with the build-up between the Sheikh Abdul-Bashir and referee Shane Sewell pending matchup that hasn't been announced yet, but it will happen at Genesis between those two men. And a lot of intensity between the whole Kurt Angle and Jeff Jarrett storyline. We saw Mike Tenay talk to Jeff Jarrett in the back, and they went over some of the details of the feud and what had happened up until the end of the night. Was a good, solid build to this matchup coming up at Genesis, their second match. One where they hadn't touched each other, the Paul Heyman philosophy, if you will. They never touch each other leading up to the big matchup. Granted, they wrestled at Bound for Glory, but tonight was the first night we saw actual physical contact between the two. This is what happens when you have a good number of weeks between pay-per-view shows to build a pay-per-view. So, good build, and I'm actually looking forward to that matchup at Genesis on January the 11th. The beautiful people, actually, with Sarah Palin out in the fan zone, outside the Impact zone, call all the fans out there a bunch of dirty marks, which I just got great joy out of. It was a very funny segment with the beautiful people outside. Matt Morgan, let's give him some props for delivering what I thought was his best promo ever, getting a little serious and talking about the pending matchup with Beer Money Incorporated. For those of you that don't know, there is a big tag team matchup coming up on a taped session of Impact before Genesis, which will change the complexity of that matchup. So if you haven't read about that or listened to this week's edition of the PWR on ESPN Radio, then that's all we're going to say about it right now. The Knockouts are going to have a matchup. It's a 8-knockout Santa's Helpers match, a second annual. And I was a little scared when they had the Knockouts dressed up like a bunch of divas backstage, but they delivered in the match. And not only did they deliver all of the Knockouts, but Taylor Wilde really the standout in that matchup. And again, TNA Knockouts showing things that they do, with Taylor Wilde doing a cross-body block off the top rope outside the ring to the other 7 participants, showing the things that they do that make their female division very different from that of World Wrestling Entertainment. We said there were 3 big matchups in that second hour. Well, AJ Styles teamed up with Devon, and we saw a beatdown after that matchup. And the question is, shouldn't the front line be expecting this by now? Where was the front line with the initial save? The beatdown went for quite a while before the save was made by the front line, and then ultimately by Mick Foley, who, as I said earlier, announced he will be in that big man event matchup at Genesis as part of a 6-man tag with AJ and Devon against members of the main event Mafia. Now, we talked about that 8 Diva knockout match, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, or I said 8 Diva knockout match, that doesn't make any sense, 8 knockout Santa's Helpers match. But did anybody else catch where the mistletoe was on ODB? That's some good stuff, by the way. ODB continuing to entertain each and every week. And again, a very impressive matchup. But, you know, the end of the match, or the end of the night, rather, with Jarrett and Angle getting into a pull-apart and BG James getting knocked out by Angle. Again, good build to the pay-per-view match coming up on January the 11th. Genesis, I thought overall tonight's Impact was a solid show, minus the wrestling. And what I mean by that is there wasn't much wrestling, but they still delivered a very purposeful show leading into the Genesis pay-per-view. And it was not a throwaway Christmas edition of Impact, which they could have easily done a best of, which I understand we're going to get next week or the week after. They could have easily done that and had a throwaway edition. Now everybody's going to talk about the ratings and how poor the ratings are going to be for this week's TNA Impact. Well, it's Christmas night, folks. A lot of people were not watching the show, and a lot of people will be tuning into the replay of Impact or watching it later on DVRs and such. So that is my thoughts on Impact for this week. Make sure you check out pwrshow.com. We've launched a brand new fantasy league, and you can get all the information and details on that fantasy league at pwrshow.com. And until our next update, thank you so much for tuning in right here on the Pro Wrestling Report.